Hello and welcome back. So Series 12 has been and gone. We've survived another year. The Timeless Children has aired. It has cracked fandom open like the hand of Omega splitting apart Skaro. Some people love it, some people think it's the best thing that's ever happened to Doctor Who. It brings the mystery back into Doctor Who. Other people, on the other hand, are like, no, they've killed Doctor Who. They've destroyed the canon. This is all worthless. So the point of this video is really to ask, is it though? I'm going to go through the Timeless Children story and I'm going to look at it in comparison to what we've already been told within the classic series and see just whether or not things actually fit and does it really break the story. What I will say before I begin is I'm not going to say whether I think that the Timeless Children arc is a good idea or a bad idea. This is purely going to be, these are the facts, what we're given, and that's it. If you want to find out what my opinions are on the Timeless Children, you'll have to wait until me and Billy do our Review of Death Series 12 full big extravaganza video. So let's start at the beginning of the story. The Master explains about old Gallifrey. Now, as far as we were concerned, Gallifreyans were just Gallifreyans before they became Time Lords, but here he explains that they are known as the Shobogans, or the Shobogans, depending on how he wants to pronounce it. We've had reference to the Shobogans in the classic series.
It's the kind of vandalism we're always running the Shobogans in for.
According to the BBC Classic Doctor Who website, the suggestion is that the outsiders who live outside of the Citadel of Gallifrey, they are also Shobogans. And so then it kind of makes sense that the originating race on the planet would be known as the Shobogans, particularly if they're going on to renounce Time Lord society. But what we are then introduced to is a new Time Lord, one of the new founding fathers, called Tecteun. This is the first time we've ever heard about her, and as far as we can tell, probably the first time that the Doctor and the Master have heard about this character as well. So Tecteun goes off, she finds this lone child under this dimensional portal into another universe or dimension or whatever, and takes the child back to Gallifrey. But before they go back to Gallifrey, they go on a whistle-stop tour of the universe, which could possibly suggest that this establishes the Doctor's love of travel, his want to explore the universe, because it's something that happened very early in his original childhood. So when Tecteun and the Timeless Child return to Gallifrey, Tecteun wins the Mother of the Year award by letting her small child play at the edge of a cliff where she immediately falls to her death. But of course, to everyone's surprise, the child regenerates into another little girl. This of course leads Tecteun to go on a quest to find out how this child cheated death, and more importantly, how can she get in on that death-cheating action herself? Now what we get to see here is Tecteun working tirelessly as the child regenerates a further 5 times. And perhaps the regenerations that the Timeless Child is going through are natural, or as I like to see it, perhaps the experiments that Tecteun is doing on this child is actually causing her to regenerate. In her mad quest to try and find out how to get these regenerative powers, she's actually killing the child over and over and over again. So eventually Tecteun gets the power of regeneration, and she regenerates into a man. Then we get the rest of the Time Lord story, and the Master explains that things happened as much as we know them to happen already. So we see Tecteun in the usual Time Lord ceremonial garb. We see the Citadel being built. It's explained that once time travel has been established, they start calling themselves Time Lords. And the fact that Tecteun is now wearing white and gold, if you're a fan of the classic series, you'll know those to be the presidential colours, so it suggests that Tecteun became the first president of Gallifrey. Now this is where things start to get interesting, because we see Tecteun meet up with 2 other Time Lords. Now we know from the expanded media of Doctor Who that there are supposedly 3 founding fathers of Gallifrey: Rassilon, Omega, and the other always suggested being the Doctor during the 7th Doctor era. So let's look at the idea of the 3 founding fathers. Well, it's very possible that it could be Tecteun, Rassilon, and Omega, and Tecteun is the other. But there's a very interesting theory put forward by Captain Jim Pye. Now, he said that perhaps, like with other Time Lords that choose their own name, we know the Doctor chose that title, we know the Master chose his, same for the Meddling Monk. And we also know from the Big Finish audio story Omega that Omega's original name is not actually Omega. That was his nickname back at the Academy, and that is something that he then took to be his title. So it's very possible that Tecteun takes on the name Rassilon. And so we see in that clip, Rassilon, Omega, and the other shadowy figure could be the other, which could be the Doctor, aka the Timeless Child, but more on that in a minute. Now, if we go for Rassilon being Tecteun, this kind of makes a lot of sense, because in expanded media, in stories like Zagreus, we know that Rassilon was working on the secrets of regeneration, and that it was also Rassilon that put forward the 12 regeneration limit. Now, of course, if Tecteun wanted to hide the fact that he'd found a child that could regenerate infinitely, and didn't want the rest of the Time Lords to know that their society was built on experimenting on a child, then it's very likely that they would change their name and go, oh yeah, I've found the secrets of regeneration in my foundry. I'm not experimenting on a child. So actually, all of that still makes sense, because at first I thought, oh, maybe Zagreus and all that stuff doesn't work now, but it actually kind of still does. That is, of course, if Tecteun is Rassilon, which then means that Rassilon is kind of like the Doctor's adopted father, which is getting a bit too Star Warsy for my liking, but more on that another time. So then, of course, we then go back to the Timeless Child, and what happens next? Well, the Timeless Child gets enrolled into the Division, which is kind of like the CIA, the Celestial Intervention Agency, which we've met before on Gallifrey. But as far as we're aware, these could be a entirely different organisation and working outside of the CIA, perhaps even beyond the knowledge of the High Council itself, doing its own secret missions, which is why the Doctor and the rest of the Time Lords didn't know about the legend of the Timeless Child. So we know from the image put forward by the Matrix that the Timeless Child goes on to be a Division agent. In the imagery, we're shown Brendan working as a guard in Ireland. The Irish thing is a nice tie to the fact that whenever Gallifrey gets mentioned, people always say,
I've not heard of it. Perhaps it's in Ireland.
Probably. Look, could I see Miss Smith, please?
And we know that at some point, the Timeless Child gets his memories wiped, and then something else happens. Either they are forced to regenerate, maybe they go on other missions. Obviously, we don't know what they've been doing, but it's probably something not particularly good. This is where we then draw a blank, and we get to the Doctor, our Doctor, the normal continuity. So at some point, after doing missions for the Division, we know that perhaps the Division needs to get rid of the Timeless Child, and so the Timeless Child has the memories erased, actually gets reverted back into a child, perhaps even a baby. The 12 regeneration limit is put in place, so as far as anyone is concerned, this person is just a normal Time Lord, and then goes on to enroll in the Academy. And that is the Doctor, the first Doctor, aka William Hartnell. And we know for a fact that all of the memories that have been spoken about from the Doctor's point of view over the last 50 odd years still remain the same. They still remain true. And we know that because the Doctor says not only can she remember them, but the Master actually says, yes, that all happened. And of course, he'd know if it all happened because he was there. Everything still stands. Kempo Rinpoche up on the mountain, yeah, he was still the Doctor's guru. The stuff in the barn that we see in Listen, that all happened with Clara. Clara telling the Doctor to take the TARDIS. Yeah, that all happened, depending on whether or not you like that idea. Yeah, everything that we see happen in the next 50 odd years of Doctor Who, fine, untouched.
And then, of course, by the time the Doctor's in his 11th incarnation, which we know to actually be his 13th and final regeneration, that's when he gets gifted more regenerations by the Time Lords. So we know that the limit was put in place because the Time Lords sent him some more. And Rassilon even mentions it in Hal Bent, saying something like,
How many regenerations did we grant you?
The only thing that we really have to talk about is, of course, the other incarnations of the Doctor, the Morbius Doctors, and the Ruth incarnation. And where do they fit into the whole equation? Well, it's very possible that the Morbius Doctors and Ruth are previous incarnations of William Hartnell. When we see that flashback when the Doctor goes, take this Matrix, or whatever it is she says, and we get that lovely montage of all the old Doctors, it gets to Hartnell, there's a bit of fuzziness, and then it goes from the very first incarnation of the Timeless Child all the way through the Timeless Child incarnations that we see in the flashbacks from the Master. Then we see the Morbius Doctors, and then we see Ruth. It's not necessarily clear whether or not these are all pre-Hartnell, or if it's all of these new memories bundled together just coming out in one go. So if it's pre-Hartnell Doctors, yeah, that makes sense until we get to Ruth, because of course Ruth has a TARDIS that looks like a police box. So there's a couple of theories here. The pre-Hartnell theory is that she has a TARDIS, it becomes a police box, at some point her memories get wiped, she turns into William Hartnell, the TARDIS gets taken back to Gallifrey, it's put in dry dock, reverted back to its original cylindrical silver form, and then when the Doctor takes it, it just happens to be that same TARDIS, which is why it looks like a police box again later on. Perhaps Clara instinctively knew that that was the one that the Doctor was supposed to take because it was the one that he used once before. And perhaps then when it arrives in London 1963, the TARDIS goes, oh, I can be a police box again. I used to like being a police box. I'm going to stay as a police box. That is a bit like, okay, it's a bit much, but we'll go with it. The other theory, of course, is the Season 6B theory. The idea that perhaps Ruth isn't pre-Hartnell, and perhaps she's somewhere between Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee. Now, this is my favoured theory, just because I think it makes more sense with the TARDIS. You know, it looks like a police box. Not only does it look like a police box, but it looks very similar to the police box that was being used by Patrick Troughton at the time. And of course, it makes sense, because the Time Lords captured Patrick Troughton's Doctor, he's sentenced to exile on Earth. Perhaps the Division come in and say, well, look, if you do some missions for us, we'll save you from being exiled to Earth. The Doctor agrees. He regenerates into Ruth. Ruth does these missions and then eventually realizes, oh dear, I've basically sold my soul to the devil, and then decides to try and escape by hiding with a chameleon arch on Earth. And then, of course, eventually the Division or the Time Lords finally catch up with her, force her to regenerate into John Pertwee, erase the Doctor's memories of all of the stuff that she did for the Division, but not only that, resets the regeneration limit, so as far as the Doctor's aware, he has not had a third incarnation, i.e. Ruth. Now, I really like this theory because it then suggests that the Division has had more of a part in the Doctor's life meddling behind the scenes than she actually realised. So, who knows, this will be something that will no doubt become more apparent as we go into series 13, 14, beyond. So how does all this pre-Hartnell Doctor stuff fit in with what we have here with the old series? Well, obviously the main thing to look at is the Morbius Doctors that we see in the flashbacks. In the Brain of Morbius, if you haven't seen it, the Doctor is having a mind-bending contest and we see these 8 other faces. Now, as a kid, I just assumed that those 8 other faces were incarnations of Morbius. And when Morbius says, "How far, Doctor? How long have you lived?" Well, I just thought he meant, well, he's lived for 3 previous incarnations, and then the rest are Morbius. It wasn't until the DVD came out that I then discovered that, according to Philip Hinchcliffe, the idea was that these 8 other faces were 8 previous incarnations of the Doctor, hitherto unseen. That, of course, then becomes tricky when they turn around in The Deadly Assassin and say you've only got 12 regenerations, and then the 5 Doctors. The Hartnell Doctor makes it clear that he was the original. So that just became a matter of contention among fans of who were those faces. But I think for a lot of people, they were just Morbius. But now, because of the Timeless Children, it is now firmly set in stone that those were previous incarnations of the Doctor, as the then producer Philip Hinchcliffe had intended. And what I like to think when you watch that scene in The Brain of Morbius is obviously the Doctor doesn't win the mind-bending contest. In fact, it nearly kills him. So what I like to think is that as Morbius is beating the Doctor in this mind-bending contest, he is slowly breaking down the mind block in the Doctor's memories to the point where he then starts seeing his previous incarnations. And that the trauma of having these unseen memories come into his head knocks the Doctor out of it, and the Doctor loses. So the question then to ask is, well, when the Doctor comes to, why doesn't he mention who were those other faces? Who was the bloke with the moustache? What's going on? Well, I guess the thing is, he's had a massive blow to the noggin, his brain has been frazzled, and I expect the memory blocks knitted back into place, and he forgot all about them. And it's not like Sarah Jane Smith's going to turn around to the Doctor and go, oh, who are those other faces, Doctor? Well, she doesn't know how many faces the Doctor had. So where else does this Timeless Children arc fit in with what we see in the classic series? Well, the other big one is, of course, the 7th Doctor. Now, during this time, script editor Andrew Cartmel wanted to add more mystery back into the character of the Doctor. And in order to do this, he created a backstory which suggested that the Doctor was one of the 3 founding figures of Time Lord Society, the other. And throughout that season 25, season 26, there are hints that the Doctor could be more than just another Time Lord. There's a deleted scene in Remembrance of the Daleks where he says,
I am far more than just another Time Lord.
He makes reference to the fact that they had trouble with the prototype of the Hand of Omega. And of course, there's the Lady Paimfort business where she says,
Doctor Who. Have you never wondered where he came from? Who he is?
He's a Time Lord, I know that.
I shall tell them of Gallifrey. Tell them of the old time. The time of chaos.
Of course, now we can look at this and retcon it and go, we know he's more than just another Time Lord. He is the founding father of Time Lord Society. Without him, there would be no regeneration. That also leaves breathing space for the whole working on the prototype of the Hand of Omega. But it all kind of makes sense. The only big question is, why does the 7th Doctor remember the whole Timeless Child thing? Or at least bits of the Timeless Child thing? Who knows, perhaps when the Rani blasted the TARDIS and the 6th Doctor smacked his head on the console off the exercise bike, I don't know, maybe it just shifted some memories around and he woke up and he was like, ah, yes, I remember certain things. And then, of course, why does the Doctor forget all of this? Well, think about it. When we get to the TV movie, the whole thing regarding the 8th Doctor is that he's a total amnesiac. He can't remember anything. In that story, the 7th Doctor gets shot. He doesn't regenerate. He actually dies.
I was dead too long this time. The anaesthetic almost destroyed the regenerative process.
You could speculate that actually when the Doctor regenerates, all of the mind blocks, or whatever the division have done to the Doctor, knits perfectly back into place. Amnesiac Doctor comes around and he's like, oh yeah, I can remember Gallifrey, I can remember my father, I can remember being half human. You know, there's no reason to say that isn't necessarily not true anymore because we don't know where the Timeless Child came from. And there are a lot of people saying that because of this, it destroys the programme, it breaks the programme now that the Doctor isn't a Time Lord and all of this stuff. But when you think about it, back in 1963, the first Doctor, he wasn't a Time Lord because that wasn't even in anyone's mind. He didn't even have 2 hearts. He couldn't even regenerate until he needed to regenerate when they needed to change the character. So there's not really anything wrong with them now saying, well, actually, the Doctor isn't a Time Lord. Well, I mean, they still are a Time Lord. They grew up as a Time Lord. They went to the Academy. So they are still a Time Lord. They're just something more, something other. And really, if you're getting incensed about the whole Time Lord Gallifrey thing, well, that's not particularly important to what Doctor Who is all about. The fundamental point of Doctor Who is that the Doctor is a time traveller who goes wandering through time and space through the universe with their companions, fighting monsters, battling great evils and winning. And so long as that still remains the same, the actual proper fundamental recipe of Doctor Who, then I don't really see what the problem is.
Or perhaps it doesn't matter either way.
Thank you all for watching. I'm sorry this was a bit of a waffly long one, but I just wanted to put my 2 cents in as to where things fit in, because I'm seeing a lot of people saying that it's just nonsense. But whether you think that or whether you don't, that's totally up to you. And like I said, I've not offered my opinion on the whole thing yet. But if you do want to hear my opinion on what I think about this whole story arc, then tune in to me and Billy doing our Review of Death Series 12, full roundup of the whole series, and I'm sure we will talk about it at great length then, and you could hear what I actually think, whether I like it, whether I don't. I'll see you all then. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.